officially open it in a month, somewhere around 22nd of June. And it's a very special place, and I'm very happy that our first guest for this first public event is Antje Grauer. I think, for me, diplomats in Kyrgyzstan, I split them into indifferent people and people who are really passionate. And for me, you have always been a very passionate person, and I admire passionate people because really, if you're a local, it's always painful to see that someone is indifferent and like, okay, he's just doing their jobs here. And we had a lot of conversations before, and I always felt that you really were trying to find this core of the problems and trying to see how you can help. And this was always touching, important for me personally. So thank you very much. And I think today we'll have a very open conversation. And before when we were agreeing to meet, I was asking Antje, would you be okay if I ask you, does UN have a future at all, especially looking at the current situation? And she was saying, yeah, exactly the questions I want to answer. So, and I think just like me, before I was starting to prepare for this event, you didn't know that Antje had a very interesting career with 6 positions related to Afghanistan. 6 different positions. Do you know? Yeah, I counted because there was Afghanistan was mentioned so many times. I had to count. So Antje's career started in IOM, International Office for Migration, Organization for Migration in Switzerland in 2001. Then a short position in GIZ with conflict prevention, and I think most of your further work was devoted to conflict resolution, right? And there was an interesting early position for 2 years as a desk officer for Afghanistan in the German Foreign Ministry. And then as a consultant of rule of law, GIZ, Kunduz, Afghanistan, then Afghanistan, Kabul, for Europol. That was an interesting fact to learn. And then I had analysis and planning in Kabul, Afghanistan for United Nations mission for Afghanistan. Then sometime in Pakistan, 2011-13, in the German embassy in Pakistan. And then Haiti was also, I think, a very, very challenging place, especially after the earthquake of 2010. So between 2014 and 17, Antje was senior special assistant to special representative of Secretary General of United Nations in stabilization mission in Haiti. No easy places. Then again, Afghanistan as head of regional office, United Nations Assistance Mission in Herat in Afghanistan. And then, would you expect a simpler place? No. A deputy chief monitor in OSCE special mission in Ukraine between 19 and 2022. And then, first peaceful countries. Looking at this huge career, more than 15 positions during these 22 years in the diplomacy. Yeah. What do you think were the main turning points? What were maybe your most loved places where you worked, where you really enjoyed more? And what were the most challenging? Can you just give a small observation? It's very interesting.
Well, thank you so much, Dania. First of all, thank you so much for having me here tonight and having me here to really sort of open the new Ololo place. It's a great honor, and I think it isn't a coincidence at the same time, because I think what very much brings the United Nations and Kyrgyzstan together and people like you and the audience is that we are very much looking for innovation and creativity that is needed to actually, sort of tackle the manifold challenges globally when I look at the United Nations and obviously also here in Kyrgyzstan, and to look at the potentials and so on. So I'm extremely happy to be here tonight.
Thank you.
Great to have you all here. I look forward to our discussion, our engagement during the course of the evening. Well, to your questions, it's difficult questions already to start with, I have to say. So let me maybe start with something differently, which is that I think I have a dream job, and I always
That's so cool to hear.
I always felt that each and every single position that I had the privilege to really hold, and every single country that I had the privilege to serve, was extremely interesting but rewarding also from the kind of work that I was able to do. And so your question is a bit difficult to answer in that sense, because I wouldn't even be able to say, sort of which one was the most challenging, or which one was the most beautiful, or which one was the most interesting, because each and every single of the countries I have been serving in, and by the way, while you split it all, you forgot to mention that most parts of my career I did serve with the United Nations, actually, or other multilateral organizations like the OSCE in Ukraine, or the EU with EUPOL in Afghanistan. So always in international multilateral contexts, really, where the mandates were very much, what the United Nations is about, which is first to bring peace, or to sustain peace and prevent conflict, but then also in very simple words, and that is what I so love about what I'm doing, and in all those countries, it's at the end of the day about about each and every single human being. The big promise of the United Nations is that every life is worthwhile to be protected and to be promoted. And that's what we are able to do in the positions that we have. So in all of the countries, it was different challenges. You were asking me about turning points. So I think, first of all, I had the chance to start as a junior professional with IOM, which was then not yet part of the UN family, but now it is. It wasn't yet, but it was associated. And that was really, it was a dream for me to work with the UN system, strictly or more widely speaking. And that dream really came true in that sense, that I really saw how it's at the end of the day about serving humanity and serving to protect the dignity of people. And IOM was, of course, dealing with migration, a topic very actual at the moment, also here, of course, but brings this really at the forefront, at the center, that it's about the people. So I think that was the very first, moment where this initial dream, which was just a fantasy, and because I had studied political science and history, so I was always interested, but I saw in practice what we can really do to contribute. And then the next was really Afghanistan, which I started, you said it, as a desk officer with the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Back then, I traveled to the country for the first time in 2004. And actually, my first visit brought me close to Kyrgyzstan, because we went back then with the minister at the times to the Vakhan corridor, and where you have the Kyrgyz minority living, actually. So that was my very first encounter with Kyrgyz back then in Afghanistan. And it was a time where I think there was so much, not only hope that Afghanistan would see a much more prosperous future, but also that the instruments of peace building could work and bring stability to countries and allow people really to live to their full potential and with the respect of their human rights and so on. And I think the next really decades were very much, like sort of driven by that belief, which I think nowadays we have to reflect upon, like sort of also the use of military versus civilian interventions. What can the United Nations really do and so on, that started then at some point really questions were being asked. And I have to say I was surprised not to hear Yemen being listed.
Yes.
You forgot Yemen.
Yeah. I didn't.
Because I think so. I served as a peace-building advisor for the special envoy, the UN special envoy for Yemen, as well for some time before then going back to Afghanistan. But just to say, like sort of, there was a time of 10, 15 years where there was lots of hope that one could support countries on their development path out of conflict in a way that was then unfortunately not really proven to be sustainable. So I think that was two moments. One, these years of hope and belief that that what we were doing would be yielding those results in the interest of the people. And then later on, the self-criticism, the reflections about whether we do have the right instruments as international community, broadly speaking, to really like sort of stabilize. And it's at the end of the day then always about conflict resolution, conflict prevention, in the context that I was serving.
Yeah, and you were in Ukraine, right, when the war started, in February 2022?
One would argue that the war started in 2014,
Yes.
but I was there indeed. I woke up in Kiev at 5 a.m. in the morning of 24th of February 2022 with missiles hitting the capital of Ukraine.
Yeah, and really, I think it's such a difficult job because really you cannot be responsible for all that because UN is not the decision maker in these processes, but UN is always blamed for not keeping the peace, right? And there was so much disappointment in what UN in inability of UN to somehow resolve the conflict in Ukraine, stop the war. And now UN is heavily criticized for what's going on with Israel. And in any war, UN is the first target of everyone. And what tools really did you have as you were there as a monitoring specialist, and not with UN but OSCE, but still OSCE. I was on one conference last year in Kazakhstan, and they invited the secretary of OSCE, and the first question was, there is no security, there's no cooperation in Europe, do we really need OSCE? And what tools really do the diplomats have, and how they feel when this happens? I don't think we have other opportunity to ask a diplomat that was in Kiev at that moment and was in a way knew all the details of what was going on from inside. Can you tell us more about that? Because I think it's a very important moment for the humanity, not just for Kyrgyzstan.
Well, it's as a diplomat, of course, you are trained, and I would argue it's also in my nature that like sort of I'm confronted with a problem and I always try to find a solution, you know, like sort of, and that's what you do as a diplomat. There's a difficult situation, you try to mediate, you try to negotiate, to find a solution to bring people together and so on. But there are, of course, situations where it takes you a little moment to recover yourself from the shock, and that was certainly one of those moments where it took a little time, also because we were then, I mean, as you said, it was with the OSCE, which is a regional organization of the UN. We had a very different mandate, so we had a monitoring mandate. Back in Ukraine, mainly in eastern Ukraine. But we had more than 1,000 staff dispersed all over the country, international and local Ukrainian staff, including in places like Kharkiv and Mariupol and Odessa and in the Donbas, in Lugansk and Donetsk, and really everywhere. So, you know, you don't have... You wake up to the missiles, and the next thing you do, like we met as senior leadership in the office at 7 o'clock in the morning and started. We also got a request to evacuate international staff and relocate national staff to bring them into safety. So we were very focused initially on that, obviously, and at the same time. So while the focus was on really saving the lives of our staff and their dependents, we were already thinking ahead and thinking of how can we make best use or put the mission and the organization to the best use in these changed circumstances. You immediately think about that, and you immediately think about, okay, we were a monitoring mission, how can we expand the monitoring, for example, you know, in the interest of the protection of the people, and to document what is actually happening. We had a dialogue facilitation mandate, so we were looking and having all kinds of discussions around how can we make use of that, you know, like sort of to bring the people together and talk. But eventually a decision was taken fast forward. But a few weeks later, the OSCE is an organization that has 57 participating states, they are called. In the UN, they are called member states. The OSCE is participating states, because it used to be a conference, one participates. But the decision-making is based on consensus among all 57, and there wasn't a consensus actually for the mission to continue its work. And so we closed. I then became the acting head of the mission and then had the task to close the mission that had actually been monitoring the situation since 2014. But long response, just to say, you immediately start thinking about, you know, like sort of how you can make best use of the tools that you have at hand to help either, you know, like sort of end a conflict, or prevent it, or protect people, provide humanitarian assistance. That was another. We were in very close contact with the UN, with ICRC at all levels, of course, to see what can we do to bring humanitarian assistance to the people in need and so on. It's just an automatic professional default, if you so want.
Well, yeah, and maybe in such moments it's good when you have things to do, like immediate tasks, right? But then anyway, after some time you start reflecting on that, right? And what were, like, can you just maybe summarize what were the findings of that monitoring? Because Russia was saying we had to start war because of the killings in the eastern Ukraine, because Ukraine was killing people for the 8 years, etc., etc. And I looked at the UN reports. You look at the number of casualties during the 8 years, and you look in the first month of the war, and there is no comparison to what was going on. And what did you find out? And maybe you can share something that is not in the very popular reports. How you saw the situation from inside. I mean, before the wars, before the February, okay, before the big war started.
Yeah, I mean, the mission did produce daily reports. It was a monitoring mission that monitored 24/7 the situation on the ground. As I said, with the focus on the contact line, as it was called then in eastern Ukraine, but also in other parts, and reported on the security situation, so also military activities, but also what is called in OSCE terminology, the human dimension, so which impact, to monitor what's the impact of that conflict, which it was already then, pre-2020, February 2022, what is the impact on the people? And I think it was in particular, so I was in charge indeed also of that so-called human dimension, and it was that impact on the people that I think got maybe at times the least of the attention, because one of the things that we see so often in conflicts, extended conflicts or war, is that the global attention dwindles after very brief periods, actually. And so while there was occasionally the topic would come up in international media, but eventually what it did to the people was really forgotten, and that's what we try to really bring to the forefront, on how people were really divided by that contact line. They couldn't cross it anymore. When COVID came, the contact line was closed for 2 years. People couldn't cross. They couldn't see like what you had, and I think that is something that's also very often forgotten. You could really feel this was Ukrainians in non-government controlled as much as in government controlled. You had families living on both sides of that contact line who then couldn't see each other anymore, and were extremely suffering under that situation, for example. So we tried to support that with dialogue facilitation activities. But yeah.
Yeah. And then just to finish about the previous career before the Kyrgyzstan, so you spent so much time working with Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, for Afghanistan, and you definitely have something towards this country. It's very close to Kyrgyzstan, but I don't think we know much. I think we are very, very far away in our minds from Afghanistan. When things are happening in Afghanistan, for us, I think, like in the media, in everything, it's like on a different continent for Kyrgyzstan. So, though geographically it's so close. And I think there is much more Afghanistan in the American media than in Kyrgyz media here. I mean, even during the early 2000s when there were military operations. So can you maybe tell us more about Afghanistan? Maybe from the diplomatic point of view, why you spend so much time, like professionally, but also maybe from your personal perspective, because if you spend so much time there, there must be some place in your heart for this country, right?
Yes, I have to say Afghanistan was still is my first big love for a country, and I have lived in other countries before, in Europe and France and Poland, and it's countries where I feel very much at home and loved being there. But Afghanistan was very different, and it hit me from the moment we actually landed. And we did this amazing trip. I will never forget it. It was back in those days. There were no commercial flights yet. The airport in Kabul didn't function properly, so one would have to fly in with military planes. And so we went to Tashkent, and from not Tashkent, we went to, how is it called? In Uzbekistan.
Nukus, I think.
No, that airport in Uzbekistan. Anyway, it'll come back in a second. And then flew, and it was with the minister, as I said earlier, to first Kunduz, And then we drove for a week from Kunduz to Faisabad to Badakhshan, the Vakhan corridor, went on to donkeys to continue the trip at some point, and just had, I mean, first of all, it's a stunningly beautiful country. It's as stunningly beautiful as Kyrgyzstan, but in a very different way. I mean, Kyrgyzstan, I love this advertisement that I saw when I first arrived here. I haven't seen it for quite some time, where you have these pictures of the mountains, and it says it's not Switzerland, and it's not Peru, and it's not Austria, and and you see how the variety of the mountains of Kyrgyzstan is just amazing. And it's the same in Afghanistan, but it's still they are still different, and the colors, you have this blue skies, and you have like sort of the red earth and ground, and then the green pastries and whatever. But it's really the people that are of a warmth and of a hospitality that I found in particular in a situation where the poverty levels were staggering at the times. They had just, it was 3 years after, merely 3 years after the fall of the Taliban, where half of the population was not able to actually, the women to participate in public life and even in private life. And so they had gone through 30 years of war, of civil war, and every family lost family members, and yet the warmth and the hospitality was just absolutely amazing. So we were received in such a manner also, and with such a kindness. And I think that was really what caught me and what made me fall in love with the place. That's at a personal level, and the beauty in the heart, really, of the Afghans. And then, as I said earlier, it was, of course, it was a time of big hope in Afghanistan. That it was just before the Loya Jirga had taken place already. It was about the first elections were about to happen, presidential elections, then followed by parliamentary elections. Afghans were full of hope, and actually, despite many long discussions, but despite many who might argue to the contrary, but democracy and basic participation of people in decision-making, or participation in basic decision-making, is at the heart of communal life of Afghans. So democracy wasn't such an alien thing for them, so they had huge hopes, and it was really an honor to work for them and try to help them, sort of fulfill these hopes. And that's so I first worked, as you said, with the German government, which of course had huge investments in terms of development cooperation and in all kinds of areas. And then I joined, which you didn't mention, the UN already in 2006, when a German was appointed as special representative of the Secretary General, and that's how I returned to the United Nations. And we had, as the UN in Afghanistan, I think, a very useful, and that's still the case. Without Tombayev could talk to you about that, obviously, now as the SRSG, the special representative in the country, but we had a very meaningful mandate as well. It was political, it was the good offices mandate, which means work towards conflict prevention at the local level, at the national level. We supported institution building, we helped the conduct of the elections, the various electoral cycles, and of course had also a role in humanitarian assistance, the many UN agencies doing that, and really sort of to help the country to move out of this humanitarian phase to development with the UN and the wider international community, which was very rewarding in those days. And that's how, in this combination, I always went back and until 2018, actually.
2019, yeah?
That's true. I left in, true. I left in March 2019. That's true.
And looking back, do you think, well, so now we see that Taliban returned, and in a way, many people feel that the hope is dead. And why do you think it didn't work, or it worked? I mean, there's this hope period, or why wasn't Afghanistani people and also like the international community that was working there, why everyone didn't reach this goal, the new Afghanistan, the more democratic Afghanistan? I remember the elections, there was real competition, the presidential elections. So looking from outside, it was very optimistic in a way. And now we have what we have. And what do you think went wrong? I mean, I understand it's a huge topic, but here, because we don't really know much, it would be good to just have maybe a short understanding from a person who saw it with his own eyes, with her own eyes.
Let's have a whole talk about Afghanistan, maybe with a few others. But so more from a personal point of view, and just looking at my own experience. Of course, it's always a multitude of factors, but I would argue that many, like sort of, it was a tension between goals that were far too ambitious on one side, that were set, and that were maybe also not necessarily set by the Afghans, but more by the international community. And at the same time, in other areas, too little attention, or too little attention too late. And what I mean with that is that I think the military campaign in the early years didn't actually, was not as forceful as it could have been, like sort of the anti-terrorism campaign, that is one. I think what was also certainly debatable was that there was something that was called the Bonn process, and you may have heard about it, but in 2021, the Bonn, the German government, hosted a conference that was supposed to be a peace conference, but eventually it was without the Taliban at the table. And how can you bring lasting peace if you don't have the parties to the conflict at the table? And I think that was, that was such a missed opportunity at the times. And so at the end of the day, and even if I started with the military aspect of it, but and I did so because there were so many suicide attacks, and they would increase in frequency over months and years as the Taliban got stronger, and it cost so many human lives, actually, Afghan lives, lives of internationals. But I think the biggest mistake was really like sort of that it wasn't the primacy of the political. Any conflict needs to be is political eventually and requires a political solution, and that was the biggest problem, that you didn't have everybody at the table. And then one could argue that there wasn't enough investment in the state building and in like sort of an Afghan-led type of state building. Yeah. So that was what I meant when saying too late, too little, possibly.
Would you say that Taliban was underestimated heavily by many people?
I guess one could put it like that. I'm hesitant because I think from, like, as United Nations, we did see the strengthening of the Taliban movement. I mean, it started in 2006 when we really saw that on one side the attention of the international community was diverted. The attention was diverted starting in 2004, so with the Iraq War. The Taliban got stronger and stronger starting in the south. We would flag that, but it was not really, we weren't really listened to also what that meant. So I think it's both, maybe underestimated, but also the attention was elsewhere of many in the international community, and misreading certainly of the situation.
Yeah. Okay, and then right after Ukraine, you come to Kyrgyzstan. It's a very big turnover. It's a completely different. Well, first of all, it's a different organization back in UN, and it was your first resident coordinator position. And Kyrgyzstan, very very different from Ukraine, very different from Azerbaijan, from Afghanistan, very different from Yemen. And how did it happen? And was it your choice? How many options did you have? And it's always interesting to know how the decision-making process is going.
Yes, so as I said, working for the UN was always a dream for me. Yeah. And so whenever I had, and I'm very grateful I had opportunities to work with other, including my own government, other organizations, but it was almost the moment I joined, I was dreaming of going back to the UN. And so while with the OSCE, which was a fascinating task, but I did actually, I did apply to become, it's a very competitive process to become a resident coordinator. One goes through lots of scrutinies and tests and assessment centers and so on. But it was, for me, really the dream job. I thought, like, sort of, in particular, there were UN system development system reforms in 2018 that were, like, sort of driven by the current Secretary General. And with that, the resident coordinators were delinked from the development program, UNDP, and moved to the Secretariat, reporting directly to the Secretary General as his or her in the future possibly representative on the ground, and you cover really the whole range of the mandate of the United Nations, which makes it extremely interesting. And so I thought this is really a position I would love to have. And so I applied when I was in Ukraine. I was accepted, got through the assessment centers and so on. And then you can start applying for positions. And it's twice a year. It's like with bilateral diplomatic services. You get a list and you can choose. And in the case of the UN resident coordinators, you can choose up to 5 positions, actually. And so I applied 3 times. For the first round, I always only applied for one country. I applied for Iran, and obviously didn't get it. My second was Uzbekistan, and I didn't get it.
Closer.
And exactly. And then the third finally was successful, and it was Kyrgyzstan. What I'm trying to say is I really wanted to come back to the region to start with, because it's a region, Central Asia, including Afghanistan, but then also Iran, where I had been, which I had been visiting during my career, both work-wise but also personally. And then, of course, I was in Pakistan, as you said. So the region is really one that is very close to me. I find extremely interesting, and geopolitically it's very interesting, and from its people it's interesting. But I always only chose one country that I applied to. And so when the list came and there was Kyrgyzstan, I was, this is where I want to go. And there were many reasons for that, actually, which is I have, since a child, I have had these fantasies of the Silk Road. It was something, we had this book at home with pictures from history about the Silk Road, and for me it was something that triggered all kinds of fantasy. I'm a person who thinks in images, not necessarily, like sort of in graphs or something like that. So I had all these images Central Asia and the Silk Road. I even smell the scent of the spices that were traded and so on. But just to say, it was really always something I found that this particular region, Central Asia, always extremely fascinating. From the people, and then of course Kyrgyzstan with the nomadic style and the country's beauty and so on. So I was very attracted, but not only because it's the region, it's the country, it's the people that I only knew of and not from own experience, but I also knew that the UN plays an important role in Kyrgyzstan.
It
and
does,
of course, in when you look at such a role, where do you want to? You want to actually be able to make a difference. And so I also looked at that. And I think my predecessors and all my colleagues, we are here, we have 27 UN agencies that are actually operating in Kyrgyzstan, have done a fantastic job in really creating this partnership between the Kyrgyz, the UN, and so we can kind of operate and interact at all levels, across levels, and really make a difference, I believe, in the country. And that was something I also found very appealing.
Yeah, I also have a feeling that UN is much more meaningful in Kyrgyzstan compared to, I don't know, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. I think the role UN plays is much more impactful in a way. You're in the middle of your term in Kyrgyzstan. What do you think are the greatest accomplishments, and what will you consider success when you move further, and you will look back at what was going on here? I know, again, not everything depends on UN. Thank you for openly speaking up against this foreign agents law, and in other cases, I think you were among few diplomats who were sound and who were speaking very openly about these things. Thank you for that. But sometimes, even with all your efforts, these laws, they go. Maybe it could be even worse. But we have what we have. And what will you consider your well done job after the 4 years, and what has already been done?
Well, what has already been done, as I mentioned, we have a multitude of agencies here that cover a whole, area of areas where we partner with Kyrgyzstan in actually, and this becomes. I hope not too boring, but it's where we really partner to help Kyrgyzstan achieve her development ambitions. I mean, that's what it's eventually about. And when I say Kyrgyzstan, I mean not only the government, but I mean the Kyrgyz people in particular, because that's what we are here to serve. So in terms of, I think we have so many achievements that we have in partnership with, the business sector, the creative industries like yourself. We look at education. We look at from really starting with basic education to higher education, where we very much focus on. We look at advancing the health systems and so on. We look in particular also at climate change, climate action, environmental protection, where I think Kyrgyzstan has, having prioritized, obviously, as a country that is so impacted by climate change, having prioritized climate action, I think what we have been really able to do is, and that's maybe the red thread that goes through many of the things that we are doing, is that we are trying to support the innovative and the creative forces that exist to actually adapt and help Kyrgyzstan to further develop and to actually tackle also the challenges that we have. And I have traveled a lot. I mean, I don't need to speak in the Ololo house too much about about the creative industries, but I want to just for a moment speak also about all the creativity that you find when you, for example, look at the agricultural sector, where there is so much innovative potential, where farmers are experimenting, where the government is experimenting, and where we support, as UN, with many agencies working in those areas, actually in, for example, applying technology for water irrigation or artificial glaciers. I was very impressed. Kyrgyzstan is a pioneer, really, in this regard, as with your Creative Industries Park, in experimenting with so-called artificial glaciers, which are built by communities to actually extend, so they are built up during the winter time, and so to extend, once the snow has melted, the melting season, if you so want, and thereby contributing, or thereby actually being a source for water irrigation of fields, agriculture, and so on. Kyrgyzstan is the only country in the world experimenting with this, and for example, so it's these kind of things, I think, that when we talk about achievements, of course, there's a lot of capacity building, there's a lot of advice, there's a lot of bringing, global expertise to the country, and so on. But when you look at what really makes a difference for the people, I think that always should be the criteria to measure success, and that's, I've just mentioned a few of those areas here, and there would be many others to mention. What is it? You asked what would I consider success, and I think I just said it. For me, it's really about making a change for people's lives. I think what is very important is, and we are working in a context where there's a huge commitment, also by the government at the highest level, to really the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And what it really means is to eradicate and eliminate poverty and inequalities. And we see that will here to actually, sort of do something about it, and to bring people lift people out of poverty. And I think already the awareness is a lot, and the prioritization. And then if we are able to support Kyrgyzstan in actually lifting more and more people, women and girls, vulnerable groups in particular that are so often forgotten all over the country, out of poverty, in a context where you still have more than 1/3 of the people living in poverty, despite the economic growth that's experienced and so on. I think that, in itself is something that I would consider a success.
Yeah, thank you. I, especially with climate, I think no one would really work in this direction if there was no UN. I mean, UN is very often criticized in Kyrgyzstan too, but if you imagine Kyrgyzstan without UN, there would be so many gaps that just no one else will cover. So thank you for this work. And so we'll move on to the audience for the questions, but last question for me before that. So, as I said, there is a lot of criticism. There is a feeling that UN needs some new format, maybe UN 2, something like that. And there's the summit for the future. Yeah, it's happening in September. And I'm hearing a lot of hope from different sides. I heard from you, but also I read in the news, and there is a lot of excitement about that. Can you speak about that, and maybe what UN is experimenting with, and why we should be hopeful that UN will maybe upgrade through all this crisis that is happening now?
Thank you for that question, which I think is an extremely important one, and one we spoke about passion. I'm very passionate about the Summit of the Future. The Summit of the Future was designed or anticipated already a few years back, actually, pre-COVID. It predates a little bit, but then ever since, obviously, the situation has changed, globally speaking, also geopolitically speaking. And so the Secretary General has invited all heads of states of all 193 member states of the United Nations to come together in September to New York. You will know that in September we always have the UN General Assembly meeting, so heads of states will anyway come. And that Summit for the Future is really with the UN Secretary General's words, it's the rescue mission for multilateralism. What he is trying to do is, of course, it's a member states process, but we are injecting ideas. The Secretary General has put out some 11 policy briefs already last year that cover topics of actually relevance for the entire globe, such as I think topics like transforming education, what should be done, what needs to be done, so that really each and every single citizens on this world enjoys quality education. Then there are a new agenda for peace was put forward that looks at what here again what kind of tools are needed, maybe also additional new tools to actually bring back peace to the globe. Then there are policy briefs on meaningful youth engagement, very, very relevant for Kyrgyzstan with its young generation, and that proposes like sort of certain ways of including youth in decision making, in creating councils, for example, that would actually support or like be involved in decision making at national, at local level, and things like that. Digitalization, a big topic, financing for development, and so on. So the idea is that this at the Summit for the Future, actually the world comes together and identifies areas for international cooperation, and identifies certain tools and measures how to advance actually sustainable development and peace, and human rights and gender equality, and that's really what the UN is about, in a context where multilateralism is challenged, in a context where indeed the UN is very often also attacked, and in a context where member states or where the world is so polarized that it has become very, very difficult to talk about certain topics, and unfortunately to talk about topics that are so fundamental for our own peace, inner peace and outer peace. But so the idea is to identify those areas where we can still, 193 nations can still reach a consensus. There will be a so-called pact for the future that will be the outcome document. It's currently under negotiations between member states. And it will look at the topics that I just mentioned. It will also include annexes on a new global digital compact that will try to strike a balance between actually the potential that comes with technology, that comes with artificial intelligence, the potential to accelerate, to advance the sustainable development goals, but also, of course, the risks that emanate from it, and risks including to human rights that stem from it, or governance. And there will be another annex that to that Pact for the Future that looks at, it's called Future Generations, that looks ahead really and tries to forge some kind of, if you so want, compact. Well, it's the Compact for the Future, or the Pact for the Future anyway, but some kind of compact around topics of climate change, other challenges that the world is being faced. And I think the excitement is really that what we see is that member states are coming together and are seriously and with all sincerity, all 193, debating these issues and demonstrating that will to find common ground in a context where that has become so difficult, because it's eventually for the people and the planet. That's something the Secretary General says very often. At the end of the day, what it's all about is to save the planet and the people. And so there's lots of hope generated around that member states are able to find themselves at a table together on topics like climate change, digitalization, education, and so on, and the achievement of sustainable developments, which is at the heart of the work that we of course do.
Yeah. Thank you. What questions do you have?
Thank you. Don't you mind of personal questions? Actually, I do have two questions. One of them is not really matters. First, I would like to know how many languages you know. That's important.
4.
They are?
They are German, my mother language,
Yeah, sure.
English, French, and Polish. And then I did learn Farsi a little bit, and I did learn Urdu a little bit, and I did learn Russian a little bit. But I wouldn't mention them. So it's really 4 languages.
So it's something like beginner elementary, right?
Very beginner.
All right. So my main question is, I'm interested in how you began your UN career when you were young.
So there is something that is called the Junior Professional Officers Program. Junior Professional Officers Program, JPO it's called. And it exists in almost all member states, that they identify, the UN looks for talent, and the UN looks for talent from 193 member states actually. And so this Junior Professional Officers Program offers the possibility for young professionals that have something like 3 years of professional experience around, to have an experience with the UN organizations, any of the UN organizations, for the period of 2 years, 1 or 2 years, it always depends. And so you are seconded, if you so want, by a member state, by your own member state. So in your case, Kyrgyzstan, I guess, would be the country, to second you to a UN agency. So I was extremely lucky to be such JPO, and that's how I entered IOM, the International Organization for Migration. Junior Professionals Officers Program, JPO. It still exists very much. I just selected one for my office. I will be having, and we have one JPO here in my office from South Korea. So I introduced her, you met her actually. And it's a win-win situation. It's a fantastic program for whoever wants to really enter the UN. It's a win-win situation for both, because as a young professional, you can still try a little bit and test. By now, these programs have advanced. You have lots of times 2 or 3 stations for a few months, and you go around the world, depending on the country you are in. And for us as organization, you get free personnel if you so want, but with lots of creative ideas, and it's mostly coming straight from university, but having worked a little bit somewhere. So you met my JPO, and you got the.
You have JPOs from Kyrgyzstan.
I don't really know whether the Kyrgyz government is having a JPO program, but it should, but I'm not sure. I can find this out. You could find this out certainly on the homepage of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I can also check it.
First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sentai, and I'm 17 years old right now. And I would firstly go far from the personal question and go to the straightforward. So we know about the veto system and how it works. The 5 countries there can decline the resolution of the UN. We have 2 clear examples when the resolution didn't pass. It was in 20th century when it was about the Palestinian Israel, and the second one is the Palestine full membership of UN. And this example when the veto system doesn't work and some of the great resolution doesn't pass. So the final question is, do you think that new veto system is needed? And if the answer is yes, how it will be perfectly for you?
I'm so glad to see that you are very closely following the really like sort of the topics of the day, but also with the resolution. So thank you so much for this question. The reforms of the Security Council governance setup, the discussions around that are not new at all, and over years they have been conducted, and they haven't led anywhere yet. But it's, I think, by now a growing acknowledgement that the Security Council, in its current composition, does not reflect the developments of the 21st century, and developments in terms also of, I mean, it was of course designed in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then that made all perfectly sense. But as I said, there is a growing acknowledgement that the reforms are needed. There are many discussions, many proposals on the table on how this could look like. At the end of the day, it's again a member states process that we as United Nations, we would then support whatever member states decide. But it's of course in the current polarized situation, it's very difficult to actually further advance these discussions about Security Council reforms. So the Summit of the Future is also having will also, let's see in which way, but discuss, broadly speaking, the governance of the United Nations. There are proposals on the table at the moment not to reform the Security Council, but to look at the Peacebuilding Commission, at ECOSOC, at giving more powers to the General Assembly, and so on. We will need to see where the 193 member states will land at the end of the day. But it's a first step towards having this conversation about a new governance form. So I know I didn't give you a very direct answer, but that's where the discussions stand at the moment. And certainly it's obvious that, of course, the Global South, as it's called, is claiming a much bigger role beyond being occasionally represented among the 10 non-permanent Security Council members.
Hello, my name is Aktan. First, I want to thank you for coming here and making this dialogue possible. And I want to thank you for coming in our country and making a great contribution for education, for safety, and many other things. My question is, considering the still present dependence of Kyrgyzstan on Russia in terms of economics and energy, what challenges or rather limitations do you think our partial dependence brings to your organization, the job you do?
So, didn't I say at some point? No. It's 193 member states of the organization, and politically speaking, that's, you know, like sort of each member state is obviously an equal member. So from that perspective, if you so want, there is no implication for the organization. What is, of course, something that we are thinking a lot about, and with our member states and donors, of which the Russian Federation is among the largest of the UN system here in Kyrgyzstan, is, of course, how to support Kyrgyzstan and actually, you know, like sort of getting out of dependencies that in any context, in any country context, anywhere in the world, would maybe not be conducive for sustainable development in that sense. And so it's in this regard, we of course also we are supporting the government, for example, in creating employment in the country, so that Kyrgyzstan would not be faced over time with the brain drain, or with young talent rather looking abroad for employment, including in the Russian Federation and elsewhere, but really like sort of wanting to contribute here because there is an opportunity for skilled and non-skilled labor and so on. So in this regard, it's of course something, you know, like sort of that we reflect upon in terms of the dependencies and interdependencies and the multipolarity of the relationships that Kyrgyzstan actually has, and where everybody, of course, brings a lot to the countries as well, on the other hand.
Hi, I'm Salima. I'm an early career journalist here. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the civil society in Kyrgyzstan? So the context of this question comes from the idea and my assumption that actually civil society holds the country together. And however, I started to question this idea after, for example, comparing it to the Georgian example in the light of recent events. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts? Because like, we are as a part of the civil society, we cannot be objective sometimes, and you are coming here and like experiencing, and I assume that you are engaged in so many projects with the civil society. What are your thoughts if we're actually going to continue, resist, and increase the level of democracy here in the country, or if we're going to meet any other challenges in the future, if the civil society is strong enough right now in the country?
Thanks for this question, which has kept me quite busy for the really, like, ever since I arrived. First of all, because I have been extremely impressed by the strength of civil society in Kyrgyzstan, by the many, like, sort of activists who have been working for really the betterment of the people for the since independence, and no matter where you go, whether you go to Talas or you go to Batken or you go to Naren or Osh, you'll meet so many people who are actually volunteering very often also, and are really the fabric of the country in so many regards. I think what has always very much impressed me is the enormous role that civil society is playing here in supporting actually the government in service delivery, in particular to the most vulnerable, be it persons with disabilities, be it children, be it girls and women, survivors of gender-based violence, you name it. It's very often when you go, in particular to the rural areas, you meet civil society that is actually, you know, like sort of even taking their private cars to deliver medicine to those in need that otherwise wouldn't be reached. And I think that is something that for me is really a very, very strong characteristics of Kyrgyzstan, like sort of where you have this value of actually also wanting to help and to share, you know, like sort of with people who are more in need than yourself. And I'm very impressed by that to start with. So all to say, I don't think a law can, you know, like sort of will destroy the spirit, really, like sort of in the society and in this regard, because it's not about a business model. It goes much further, as I just said. It has a lot to do with expressions of solidarity and with those more in need. Of course, it is of concern, and I have, as the UN representative, expressed this concern, and I had many conversations with civil society, with the authorities. It is of concern that we do see what we refer to as a shrinking civic space. It is of concern that a situation seems to be created where certain civil society groups, activists might face much more difficulties in the future, be it human rights defenders, for example, to do the job that is so important. By the way, also important, I would argue, for the economy and the creative economy, because of course you need, you know, like sort of open exchanges, and you need opposition, you need, you know, like sort of to debate ideas, controversy, and so on, to further advance and innovate and so on. So it is of concern, and I can only hope that I can hope, and I trust also, that the civil society is resilient enough and to actually continue doing the work that is so important in this country, actually.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It was very inspirational and helpful and interesting. My name is Ayjana. This month I'm graduating from International Relations faculty, and my question would be kind of political. So I do believe that our country and overall Central Asian region faces a lot of challenges in various sectors like environmental, security, and etc. But despite we have so much uniqueness, and you have already mentioned it, thank you so much for seeing that in our region and country. And my question is, for future policymakers or just on individual basis level, what should we focus on to resolve these issues and to use this uniqueness to further prosper and to move towards development and cooperation between the countries in the region, towards stability and security and etc.? Thank you.
This is, yes, this is like sort of, this is a topic for a doctoral thesis, I would say. But let me just start with the regional aspect here, and that also inspired, I'm coming today, there are women leaders from the other Central Asian countries in Bishkek, actually, because Kyrgyzstan is this year hosting what is called the Women Leaders, Central Asian Women Leaders Dialogue Caucus. And I was just there this morning for many hours, and not only very impressed by very strong women from all over Central Asia, but also very impressed by how over the last few years, really, Central Asian countries have come so much closer together and are cooperating so much closer on so many in so many fields, economically speaking, when it comes to connectivity, but also what I think will be an extremely important topic, even more so in the future than it is now, and that is the whole climate change agenda, with so many risks that are transboundary, of course. And just to look at the geography with the glaciers melting much faster, and obviously what is happening in Kyrgyzstan in this regard is impacting neighboring countries and the other way around. So I think regional cooperation will be the key actually for stability, economic prosperity, and peace eventually in the region. So I think what we are seeing the last few years really in the Central Asian countries at all levels. Today it was parliamentarians, but we have so many fora now on regional cooperation. So that is certainly something I think that's to see even more of in the years to come, really, as a stabilizing and as an engine also for growth, actually, with trade being further facilitated and enabled within the Central Asian countries and then beyond. So that is certainly one of the areas, and linked to that are, of course, also other risks such as water and so on, which just bear the risk for conflicts and which hopefully will be avoided, and many people are working obviously on that in that regard. When it comes to Kyrgyzstan itself, it is such a big question, actually. I mean, there is so much potential in the country. I think what is indeed extremely important is to create the conditions for employment. That is, for me, really at the heart. For employment, we already spoke about it, where really the 7 million Kyrgyz citizens, women and men, can live the lives to their fullest potentials, and really whatever they aspire for themselves. And for me, there the investments into the labor market, into the creation of employment, is really absolutely critical. While of course it will be extremely important to cater to those that live below the poverty line at the moment, and are at risks of food insecurity and the like. So, but with the labor market element, I think what is extremely important is, of course, the investments in education. And here, in this regard, I'm really happy to see that the government is prioritizing education. The president went to the Summit of the Future. Not the Summit of the Future, that's to come, the SDG Summit last year in New York, and made commitments how to accelerate really the achievement of the SDGs, and education was at the heart of it, and quality education, and I think that's really key in this regard.
Good evening, my name is Timur and I'm 16. So first of all, thank you for coming here today, for being here today, and sharing so much information with the general public. My question is not that political, so I guess it will not be so hard. Is there any opportunities for teenagers, high school students to engage in UN programs, maybe as a volunteer? Thank you.
Absolutely, and I'd love to speak with you and whoever else is interested in actually doing so afterwards, and I can give you contacts. We have many possibilities. We have to start with, we have something that I'm very proud of, I have to say. As a country team, we decided in 2022, well, it started in 2023, but that we would want to seek the advice of youth. And so we established a youth advisory board that is actually composed of some 15, 20 young people from all over the country. We've presenting all ethnicities, genders, and really all oblasts. We also have persons with disabilities. really cool people, like sort of that have, I'm dreaming of having that many followers, like really influencers who are 15 years old and already have something like 100,000 followers and so on. But so there's that. But then we have organizations such as UNICEF, for example. They have the youth volunteers, and it's a super interesting approach where you are elected eventually through a process, and then you are like an ambassador of UNICEF, a youth ambassador in a certain area, and all, of course, to support the work of UNICEF, but other organizations also have that. So very happy to connect you. There are plenty of possibilities to actually get engaged at the age of 16, 12, 14. Thanks.
Hi. Okay. I always do the wrong distance with microphones, so I think this is proper. My name's Mackenzie. It's really nice to meet you. I'm so happy so many people are here and meeting all of you as well. I'm curious about the reintegration and return of foreign terrorist fighters and women and children who were detained primarily in Syria and Iraq, in Central Asia in general, but in particular in Kyrgyzstan. And that's something that the UN has really been involved in with a lot of advocacy and oversight and security cooperation. It takes a lot of people to make that happen. I think there's a pretty broad consensus that the return and reintegration has been very successful so far, and it's really an example of Central Asian countries taking the lead on something which kind of heightens the stakes for how it ends up long term. It could be a blueprint that other countries like the one I belong to, the United States, to really learn from. And so I'm wondering, from your experiences in other countries, what kinds of things are you looking for, or what things should we be monitoring to make sure that the reintegration of these Kyrgyz citizens and the de-radicalization in some instances is successful, so that we don't pay too little attention too late, or we're looking at the wrong things?
I love the question. Thank you. So, indeed, the UN has been very involved in the return. Well, not so much the return, but mostly the reintegration of children, but also mothers and their children from the two countries that you mentioned, Iraq and Syria. The program is still ongoing. It's early days, at least when we look at the return of the mothers with the children. The first group of returnees were children, actually, alone. And we look at Kyrgyzstan really here as a model, and for various reasons. Because first of all, the government, from day one, I would say, approached this matter, which is very sensitive, and there are fears on all sides. There are emotional needs on all sides. It's those who return and reintegrate are very often traumatized, psychologically speaking. The government, from the very first moment on, approached this in a very holistic manner, and from the very first moment understood what I just mentioned, also the emotional aspects of it, including the emotional aspects maybe in the receiving communities. And so really like sort of approached this return and the reintegration in that holistic manner, involving all the state institutions that are required, involving international expertise, involving not only the UN but also the ICRC, in this regard, and again, by the way, civil society organizations to do the groundwork with the communities. And I think that is one, really, this holistic approach, which is the precondition for a successful reintegration, and then the focus on reintegration. And reintegration we'll see also in acknowledging that a lot of work needs to be done with the communities, a lot of support needs to be dedicated, allocated, including at the individual level of supporting the kids and reintegrating in the schools and helping the teachers to actually understand their needs and the other pupils and the parents of the pupils and so on. So I think these two issues, focus on holistic approach and on reintegration, is are the two factors for the success.
So thank you so much for your presentation, for your answers, and for the opportunity to be here and ask you. So my name is Emira Sidinalieva, and currently I'm working as a program coordinator for the Public Foundation Sustainable Development Initiatives. And actually, my question is a bit long, but I really wanted to ask you about this. So I wanted to ask you about the possibilities. Maybe you are planning as UN system in Kyrgyzstan to support young people, young voices of Kyrgyzstan or maybe of Central Asia on the global level, on the global area, because I myself participated in the development of national and Central Asian joint action plans on the PAV agenda, and also I was a speaker at such forums like International Youth Conference, Global Peace Summits, and you know that whenever I participated in such platforms and such networks, whenever I saw, such fellowships and opportunities, we can always see representatives from the Africa, USA, Europe, some people that originally from the Middle East, but actually I would dare to say that we can really rarely see representatives from the Central Asia and especially of Kyrgyzstan. And actually I know that in Kyrgyzstan we have Youth Advisory Board. To be honest, my colleagues and my close friends, the part of this board. A few years ago, we had like SDGs ambassadors, SDGs Academy in Kyrgyzstan, and to be honest, unfortunately, there is no much information about the activities of these platforms, about these activities, and I think that as you can see in Kyrgyzstan, we have like really so many young activists, so many young leaders and youth-led official organizations, and I think that it would be really great if UN system in Kyrgyzstan could support more young people in the decision making, not only on local level but also on global level. And my question is, I wanted to ask you about: are you planning as UN system to support youth voices of Kyrgyzstan? Thank you.
So also. Fantastic question. Thanks for that. Well, yes. First of all, yes, we do support what we are really trying to do. In particular, in regards to what you are asking, to connect the local youth with the global discussions. Now, this is indeed always, we are competing with 192 other member states in this regard. So sometimes, like sort of when it's about physical representation, let's say in New York in events or so, it's then sometimes really difficult to organize. But we did have, for example, something that I thought was extremely well received and actually also impactful. We had last year, there was the ECOSOC Youth Forum, and we used, it so happened that I was in Narin at the time, visiting Narin, and so we organized a whole forum with youth that would how shall I say, contribute to the ECOSOC Youth Forum. And we then ensured not only a summary of the recommendations that came from Talas Youth at the ECOSOC Youth Forum in New York, but we also had youth representatives who were connected online and were actually even given a speaking role, 2 of them. So we try whenever it is possible actually to do these things. We have a few agencies, I already mentioned UNICEF, there's also UNFPA, but also others, UNDP and others who do that. And we certainly are currently discussing and looking at what we can do to actually, in the context of the Summit of the Future, to repeat what I just described, like sort of where we bring the voices of youth of Kyrgyzstan to the Summit of the Future. And there will be a few opportunities in September to do so. And we are currently having discussions among all the 27 agencies how we can actually create platforms for recommendations and ideas of Kyrgyz youth to be fed into the Summit of the Future. So we have this very much on our radar. But first of all, there are so many young people in Kyrgyzstan, so I'm sure it's at times you can't see it. But I'll also take your point that you don't find information. So I'll discuss with colleagues to make sure that we put these things actually on our webpage and that you find them easily or down up in social media, but also happy to speak with you afterwards.
Good evening, everyone. Mr. Amanaliv, I really thank you for having such an opportunity. Ms. Grabe, thank you for being here tonight. And my name is Baktikul. I'm expert in working with increasing productivity and efficiency of company employees through working with stress and burnout. And I have a plain question. Hey guys, I'm really proud of you. Our young people are so hard. You got a lot of hard and challenging questions. I have a plain question, maybe not. I'm not sure. What is happiness for you and what is success for you? And is it possible, how do you think, is it possible to be happy and successful at the same time? And if yes, what's the main condition for that?
Let me start with success, because I think that brings us very quickly to the happiness part. For me, success is, and I think I hinted at it or mentioned it already earlier, for me success is when I'm able to put my talents, my knowledge and my passion to the cause I really care about. And that immediately brings you to happiness. Like sort of that, because you feel that you do what, and obviously that is not a constant state. But for me, happiness is when I feel I'm in sync in what I'm doing with what I'm meant to be doing, like how I was created, what is there some higher plan that has equipped me with the abilities and the opportunities that I had the huge privilege of having, but that I'm able to actually make use of that. And in my particular case, really in the interest of humanity and peace.
Yeah, and there's so many reasons to be proud in your work. So, thank you. So we have a traditional closing question for these events, and thank you. We took more of your time than even we were planning, and thank you for being so open. I think everyone was so engaged, and really proud of our young people with their level of English better than mine. So it's great. It's great to see. I think this country does have future. So the question that we always ask the diplomats, what were the 3 books that had biggest impact on you in your life? I mean, professional books or maybe fiction. What could you name?
I should have looked at the last question of the films. All right. So, what had a huge impact on me was, and now I need to wait. How was the translation of it? Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being.
Yeah.
Right. That was a book that really.
Really?
Yes,
Okay.
it did very much. I mean, at younger age, but I think it was even that book that eventually brought me to Central Europe, that eventually brought me to Poland, even though Milan Kundera is not Polish, but Czech. So that is certainly one. Then Mitch Albom, and I'm just like sort of I'm trying. It's the translations. I read those books in German.
Yeah.
so it's let's leave it at Mitch Albom, who was Albom. How do you pronounce him? Albom. Who was another author who really like sort of had huge impacts on my life when I was an adolescent and into the early 20s, mid 20s, I would say, because it was so existential what he was writing about, and it gave so many inspirations. In terms of eventually showing that it's all about empathy and kindness in how one. I can't see. That's my problem.
Okay.
I don't have my reading.
Okay.
Oh no, I have my reading glasses here. Let's see. The Next Person You Meet in Heaven.
Oh.
That's the book that I was looking for. I can only recommend that. I think it's foundational and fundamental. Anyway, and the third book. 3 books you want. You know, my problem is I have read so much in my life.
But it's always hard to
It's
like.
always,
but I mean, maybe a few more. It's not a big deal to name 3 only.
So we had Milan Kundera, we had Mitch Albom, and then I think it was really Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn.
Oh.
Yes.
The Gulag Archipelago?
Yes.
Really? Solzhenitsyn, though.
Yes.
Why? I mean, in what way it had impact on you?
Well, so I'm from a generation in Germany that was brought up with really the motto of never again. And very much like in our upbringing, we would, the questions of totalitarianism, of autocratic systems, of terror regimes would eventually be one that accompanied us through our entire school period, because, of course, of the Second World War and Nazi Germany. And so it has always been a topic, or I think it's not by coincidence that many Germans of my generation actually chose professions like mine, you know, like sort of where you indeed try to make the world a little bit more peaceful than it actually is, and protect the human rights of everyone, and so on. This has a lot to do with our own history. So studying the various terror regimes and what political systems can do to also human beings with the view to preventing repetitions is, I think, something that has been for decades very much at the forefront of my thinking and reflections, and eventually professional choices as well.
Yeah, thank you. This book had a huge impact on me too, and I wish everyone in Kyrgyzstan read this book, because this way I think we could prevent a lot of things that are already happening, right? So thank you. I know the topics that we could have here are endless, and I think we only scratched the surface. But I'm happy that more people will know you from different sides, and I think sometimes people only see you on the conferences, and you give the speech that you must give, and you say the things you must say. So it's always better when you can talk, when we can talk as a personality with you, right? So it's a huge privilege. Thank you for spending time here. I know it's not enough, but maybe you have other opportunities to create your own events and invite, and I'm sure Antti is one of the most open diplomats ever in Kyrgyzstan. I'm sure you would be joining to university, schools, and etc. So it's a unique opportunity. Not always we have diplomats that are open enough to do that, right? Thank you very much for being here, Antti, and thank you for everything you do for Kyrgyzstan. I see that, and I really appreciate what you do.
You allow me to thank you, and to thank in particular also this fantastic audience. Indeed, you challenged me, and that's always great. And it was a true pleasure and honor and privilege to be here. And as Dania said, I'm very open to also walking on nails and things like that. You remember that in your ololo place in Osh? No, but in particular to please reach out if you have any questions. I'll put you in touch with agencies who do work with youth. Give me your contacts if you want, and very much looking forward to seeing you and engaging with you on other occasions. Thanks a lot.
I think the story needs explanation, because when Antti just arrived to Kyrgyzstan, before we met personally, Antti went to Osh, and she saw the first ololo she saw was in Osh. And that ololo is our common project with UNDP, so UN had its role there. And I'm hearing and I'm asking my colleagues, okay, how the visit went, did you speak, and how it was? And they said, imagine she was standing on nails. Стояние на гвоздях, да? So how much time do you spend standing on nails?
On the nails?
Yeah.
It was so painful that I couldn't count the seconds. You need to ask that wonderful woman. It was young female entrepreneurs, actually, who I was meeting. And one was a yoga teacher and a teacher in mental strength and resilience and so on. And one of the tools that she used was like sort of that she let people walk over these nails. And of course, I always say yes, and then I end up in these situations. Riding on horses with ministers or standing on nails with young entrepreneurs or so.
You immediately won their hearts, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.